When I was 8, my friends and I talked about what we wanted to do when we grew up, and our ambitions varied from athletics or zookeeping to flying to the moon. And as we mapped our undetailed lives, I realized that my own plans were a little strange because I wanted to devote my life to finding the world's most extraordinary plants. Pathless Forest is the tale of a man who longed for something and was drawn to the other side of the globe towards it by invisible threads, something that made him uncharacteristically reckless and bold. Like Apollo, he dared, and he was driven to extremes by an unrequited love, in this case, for a plant. And the harder he chased, the more he was rejected by that plant. And he was dragged through hell to heaven and back to find it, and driven half mad in his obsession to do so. But so it was that I followed tribes down deep into the abyss to find Rafflesia's hidden flowers and drip blood, sweat, and tears on them and feel my life change forever. And so this is the story about a botanist, some foresters, a flower, and how our lives intertwined. And tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take you to some of the remotest forests imaginable, places where almost no one goes. This is an untrodden wilderness. It's inhospitable, magical, and wild. Before I go, a little bit about myself. As Mark, in his kind introduction, said, I'm a wildlife artist, a botanical illustrator, as well as a botanist. And for me, that's a way of making sense of the natural world and the beauty that I feel so fortunate to see in my work. When I see a striking work of nature, and I'm going to share some of those with you tonight, it gives me what I can only describe as feeling like a sort of electric shock running through me, like a current of electrical energy. And that's something that I hold on to. It's quite an experience to see something like the flowers I'm going to show you later. And then when I come home in a calmer, more steady way, I sort of download, I guess, that electrical energy in the form of paint through a brush, and capture some of the beauty that I've seen through oil paints or watercolors. And what I use to do that depends on the subject that I want to capture. So that one on the left there, that's a plant called Glossostemon, and that's used, it's important in herbal medicine in Iraq, for example. And so that was a piece that I did for a project working on the flora of Iraq. The next one along is a pitcher plant, Nepenthes raja, the largest of all the pitcher plants. And that's one I painted in oils because I really wanted to capture some of the vibrancy of the mountain in which it grows. And then the next two are more relevant to tonight's talk. I like to try and capture some of the people who've been so kind as to share their special flowers with me on some of these adventures on which I've been. This is a photograph I took of Rafflesia, the subject of tonight's talk, the largest flower in the world. And this is a photo I took on my phone of an old book, a cherished dog-eared book, one of those books that smells of vanilla when you open it. We've all got one on our shelves. And as a child, I'd sit cross-legged and stare at this picture. And I thought, my goodness, one day I really want to see this in the wild. But Southeast Asia as a child may as well have been the moon to me back then. There's no way I could get to the jungle to see this plant. I had to wait till I grew up and became a botanist to do that. And so what I did was I created a life-size replica of it out of papier-mâché and paint and clay. And I made this sort of realistic plant, as realistic as I could. And I staged it in an old cemetery, a sort of tumble-down cemetery behind our family back garden, among the fallen tombstones and the netted briars, places where you find foxes and hedgehogs and that kind of thing. And I'd scramble up into a yew tree and swing from the ivy vines and pretend that I was in the jungle. And then I'd just sort of sit and stare at it, pretend that I was an explorer, spending a moment with the world's largest flower. And that was the closest I could get then to seeing Rafflesia. But it was really here that my story put down roots, and that I had these ambitions to see these extraordinary flowers in the jungles of the Far East, which is the only place where you can find them. This is a rather nice quote I found quite recently in an old book in the library at Oxford Botanic Garden, where I work. And it says, all these peculiarities explain the uncanny impression made by the organisms upon their discoverers and upon all subsequent observers. We tend to talk a little bit differently now about discovery, which I'll come on to later. But the point here in this quote is the uncanny impression that this plant makes, to which I can truly attest. To see something as extraordinary as Rafflesia, it's just depicted on the right in that little illustration there. A sprawling bloom a metre across erupting from the rainforest floor is a truly extraordinary experience and absolutely unforgettable. Before I whisk us away to some remote forests, I'll talk a little bit about the biology of Rafflesia, because it really is, in many respects, a botanical enigma. So for a long time now, botanists have been studying, trying to coax it out of the earth and examining Rafflesia and trying to disclose its secrets. But there really is a lot that we don't know about Rafflesia. First things first, it's a parasitic plant. So as Mark said in his introduction, this is a group of plants that's always fascinated me. Parasitic plants are those that steal their food from other plants. A common example would be mistletoe, but mistletoe, as you know, is green. It's photosynthetic, so it does manufacture at least some of its own food. There are other parasitic plants, we call them holoparasites, that pilfer their entire existence at the expense of other plants. And in the most extreme cases, they lack leaves, stems, roots, chlorophyll, and they scarcely resemble what we even might think of as a plant at all. And often people think they look more like fungi. That's a whole different kingdom altogether. These are not fungi, but you could be forgiven for thinking that they look a bit like them. There are some 40 or so species, depending on your definitions, of Rafflesia, and they all grow across Southeast Asia. They're all wholly parasitic, holoparasites, and they spend almost all of their life cycle actually within another plant. So this is a case of a plant within a plant, which is quite extraordinary. So on my illustration on the right there, you can see at the top some green leaves. They belong to a tropical vine called a tetrastigma that belongs to the grapevine family. And then on the right, you see that circle. Possibly you can't see it very well. And actually, that's the point, because there's really not much to see, because Rafflesia spends most of its life as what we call an endophyte, a little strand of cells that lives inside this tropical vine, sort of moving about via its molecular floor plan within its host, stealthily gathering up nutrition, making plans, getting ready to send out into the world an enormous flower. After a period, it's not known how long, particularly in most species, it will then send a bud into the world, and that takes up to 9 months to swell. So it sort of nurtures this monstrous thing on the forest floor that over the course of several months balloons to the size of a pumpkin. And then overnight, it will open to unfurl and produce this extraordinary flower. And they vary in size. The smallest are about the size of an outstretched hand, and the largest, as I've said, spans a metre across. That one's in Sumatra. So it has a very unusual biology. There are only 4 examples in the plant kingdom of plants that live inside other plants. And for biologists, this makes them hard to study because, you can't see them for most of their life cycle. And it also makes it practically ungrowable. So this is a plant that has never been grown outside Southeast Asia, not to be confused with the Titanarum that grows in botanic gardens, which I'll cover later on. This one is very intractable in cultivation, and its seeds don't store in seed banks. So if we want to conserve this plant, it's a little bit difficult for us to do so, which I'll come on to a little bit later in the talk. But of the 40 or so species of Rafflesia, most of them are difficult to see. There are 1 or 2 that are quite easy. There are a couple in North Borneo that you can see without really trekking, and 1 or 2 in a few other places. But most of them are very difficult, and 1 or 2 are damned difficult, as I will share with you in this talk. My adventure starts here in the Philippines, and in a little roadside gaff, my good friend Adrian Tobias, who's a gifted young botanist in the Philippines, he said to me, Dr. Chris, there are 2 paths, and we must choose one. And I said, and he was talking about us reaching a particularly rare species of Rafflesia. And I said, well, which is most likely, Adrian, to lead to the flower? And he said, the longer path. And I said, great, let's take that one. And he said, but there are risks, Chris. And I said, well, what are those risks? And he said, well, we'll have to spend a couple of nights in the forest. I said, that's fine, I can do that. And then he paused and he told me, recently, though, someone in that particular forest was shot dead by an arrow. So in the end, on that particular adventure, we opted for the slightly shorter and safer path, compliant with our risk assessments in Oxford. But actually, the point is, nothing is truly safe in a Rafflesia adventure. You have to take some risks if you want to find some of these really rare species, as we did. And so our adventure starts here in Mount Makiling, a place with baby leeches and other blood-sucking, not the really big ones yet. This is a fairly tame environment. It's quite an easy climb. But nevertheless, it's still a bit of a wilderness, and it's not actually that far from Manila in the Philippines. So you don't have to get too far from the city to find a species of Rafflesia in the Philippines. I love this place, actually. I've been up Mount Makiling several times now, and I've got to know its sort of jungly foothills and its flora. And here are the two protagonists of my adventure tonight. So on the left there is Adrian Tobis, who I've already mentioned, a very talented young botanist. And then on the right there is his supervisor, Pastor or Pat Malabrigo, professor of forestry and the Philippines' #1 botanist. There is really not a plant that he cannot name in the Philippines. And I have an enormous respect for these botanists and their team who I've worked with, their knowledge, their wisdom, and their kindness and generosity for sharing their extraordinary plants with me. And this was the first Rafflesia that we saw on this adventure. This is called Rafflesia panchoana. And this is a Rafflesia species that the flowers are a little larger than the size of an outstretched hand. So on the left there is my painting of it, and then on the right is a photograph I took a couple of weeks ago on a different mountain with a forester to show you the scale of this flower. So it's one of the smallest, largest flowers, or as Pat, my colleague, calls it, a little big flower. And it's really a mesmerizing and strikingly beautiful work of nature. I think it's one of the more beautiful species of Rafflesia. It pushes out through the forest floor a sort of flurry of flowers. You have a sequence of them. So it means you've got a good chance of finding one open when you go on a Rafflesia trek, which cannot be said for all of them. It's a blood red flower, and it has a sort of constellation of stars over its surface that fall and fade with the contours, like a work of Isha, that give you an uncanny sense of distortion of the scale of the flower. And if I were to show, this is a painting, but if I were to show you a photograph, again, you wouldn't be able to tell easily, I don't think, how big or small the flower is. It's a truly beautiful thing. And in the center there, in the cavity, with all those tiny little white dots around it, sits what looks for all the world like a creme brulee. That's the disc. That's the sort of the inner mechanism, the works of the flower. Rafflesia flowers quite famously smell bad. So they actually smell of rotting meat for a very good reason. They attract pollinating flies. So when we think of pollination, we tend to think of it in our human-centric way as being almost something for our own enjoyment. That, you know, you've got beautiful flowers, they produce nice perfume, nectar, bees come along and we like those too. And it's nature's most ancient bartering system going on. And it's this lovely quid pro quo where the flower gets something out of the bargain and so does the bee. The bees are the couriers for the plant's pollen. But there are some flowers that have broken the rules, and Rafflesia does it in a big way. So Rafflesia is mimicking rotting flesh to attract flies to be its pollinators. And it produces a smell that is uncannily like rotting meat. And they all smell slightly different. And this is an area of research that I do that there isn't time to talk about tonight. But I can say that this one smells precisely like bad chicken. If you open a pack of chicken and it's gone off, that's what this one smells like. But they're all subtly different. And that's because it attracts flies, as I say, to pollinate it. So these flies mistake this flower for being a dead thing. Dead things are what flies like to visit to lay their eggs on so that they can reproduce. And so it's intriguing, isn't it, that that Rafflesia has sort of inserted itself into the life cycle of flies in a way that they actually do not benefit at all. And that's interesting to evolutionary biologists to understand how does the flower over long periods of time manage to perpetually outwit these insect pollinators, because these insects are actually investing their most precious thing on this plant, i.e. their young. They sometimes lay their eggs on flowers such as these, which will later perish because there's nothing for them to feed on. So it's, again, interesting from the point of view of its pollination biology as well as its life cycle as well. So this was the first Rafflesia species I saw in the Philippines. And it starts this adventure in the Pathless Forest that I described. So we've seen the Philippines, or one of the Philippines' smallest Rafflesias. So later I'm going to show you the biggest. This is my illustration of Adrian with Rafflesia panchuana to give you an idea of the scale. Adrian's quite a small chap, but nevertheless, the Rafflesia you can see is also a small flower. And we sat and peered at this plant for a while. And I sometimes think of this, that whilst 8 billion people were busy doing what people do around the world, 2 of them sat gazing at one of the world's most extraordinary flowers. Here's another, rather more beautifully, I guess, arguably, that grows in the same location, just about 100 meters away from that Rafflesia, actually. I'm sure you'll know it or will have seen it. It's a jade vine, and they're flowering at the moment in Kew. To see a jade vine in a botanic garden glasshouse is a wonderful thing, but to see a jade vine in nature is a breathtaking experience. And on Mount Makiling, this is where the plant was first scientifically documented, in fact. So this is what we call the type locality of the jade vine. And it produces these flowers of an extraordinary shade of turquoise. And I wanted to include that picture, though it's not a very good one, with my hand, to show you that I've not messed about with the filters or the colors, and I don't need to, because it's an ethereal shade of turquoise. And they hang in these long racemes. And in the wild, they're much longer, as you can imagine, than they are in glass houses here. So much so that I once found one, you can see there on the left, that actually sort of reached the forest floor, and then almost like a bolt of electricity, it earths there in this pool of sort of blue energy. It really is an otherworldly flower that grows here on Mount Makiling. To me, to the foresters there, this is a common miracle. And so if in my picture, the guys look a little bit nonchalant about their jade vine, that's because to these guys, this is like seeing a foxglove, you know, so they see this almost every day. So whilst I was sort of ecstatic about seeing this jade vine, these guys, as I say, to them, it was perhaps a common miracle. Here are some other wonderful plants that grow in the Philippines. You possibly recognize the one on the left. It's sometimes described as the Rolls Royce of houseplants, so you can grow it in your home. It's a medinilla, or a rose grape. And I remember reading in books a long time ago that it grows in the wild out of the fork of trees. And it really does. So it doesn't really ever touch the ground. It grows in a bed of moss around the fork of trees, is what we call an epiphyte, in these places that are never dry. So these forests, they bathe in mist and nothing ever dries ever, including your clothes and everything else that you take into the forest. The one next to it, I don't know if we have any botanists who recognize this one. I have to admit, I didn't know what it was until I saw it. Well, it's a Dillenia. It's also called an elephant apple, Dilleniaceae. That's the flower in the middle. It looks like a giant magnolia or something with these satiny petals. It's a beautiful thing. And then on the right is the rather extraordinary looking fruit, and it's an edible fruit as well. These plants I all captured growing in a forest reserve called a land grant, which is in the Sierra Madre of the Philippines. And a place I've got to know quite well and have spent some time in this environment. And I'm going to share a little more at the end of the talk as to why this is an important place. This is Kuya Dante, Kuya meaning older brother Dante, holding an ant plant. And I was so excited when we found this. So we were trekking around the Lang branch, which is mainly secondary rainforest, but quite mature and a wild place nevertheless. And we found what I think of as like a fallen star. So this is a plant that grows tethered high up in the trees, and for the most part, you never see them. So it grows up in the tree branches, and this one happens to fall down from the canopy to the floor. So we were so lucky to find it, like something washed up by the tide. And it was sort of volatile in that it was covered in ants for a very good reason. So this ant plant, as it's known, if I were to cut it open, what you'd see inside would be a sort of honeycomb-like structure of labyrinths, quite beautiful, in fact, hollow galleries that are all interconnected. It produces those autonomously, so it develops them as it grows. And then ants, for a particular species, make their home inside the plant. So there are little entrance holes on the outer surface of that balloon-like structure. The ants crawl inside and they make their home inside there. And there's this wonderful symbiosis that evolves between the plant and the ants. So the ants have this wonderful purpose-built accommodation up in the trees, this lovely sort of labyrinth, like a posh hotel for ants in the tree canopy. Meanwhile, the plant benefits in a way that's perhaps more subtle. So anyone who's disturbed an ant's nest will know that they object violently to that, and out they come and attack their invader. And so this is to the benefit of a plant because it has an inbuilt army, patrolled accommodation, if you like. These ants will come out and attack any would-be weevil, for example, or herbivore of the plant. So it has this hardwired protection, if you like. And so ants and plants have been crossing paths for well over 100 million years. And so they've evolved these wonderful and intricate symbioses. And a colleague of mine, Guillaume Chimicki, has actually seen in a different species of ant plant in Fiji that the ants actually collect the seeds of the ant plant and they plant them in the crevices of the tree bark. So they're effectively investing in their future generations' homes, which is rather nice. Now I'm going to take us to a different province in the Philippines, to the Aurora province, to Mount Banahaw. This is seen as a sacred mountain in the Philippines. In the photograph, we see Kuya Julius on the left and Adrian on the right. And Julius was our guide. When we arrived at the foot of the mountain, I was the object of curiosity. Not many tourists, or no tourists actually, go to this particular mountain. You need permission to go there. And Julius was told that he would have a nosebleed that day by association with me. I'm not sure why. Anyhow, we set off up the mountain slope. This is a very interesting place. It's a place where lots of people live around the foot of the mountain, but it's also very rich in endemics. So in some respects, it's a challenging place because where nature and people come into conflict, it can be tricky from a conservation point of view. But nevertheless, this is a mountain that is home to 140 species of tree, compared with our 60 or so native species of tree across the whole of the UK. You know, that's just on one mountain. At the top of the mountain is a screaming crater, 3.5 kilometers wide. And an entomologist in the Philippines told me that years ago, he and his team visited the top of the mountain and they heard a cicada cry that sounded exactly like a baby's cry. And then they feared that there was an evil spirit there. And it's never been documented again. So it exists only in their memory and on this mountain. So it's you know, something that's not really very well known to science. So it's a place of mystery. And we went there for a very rare species called Rafflesia banahawensis. And I was so excited when we arrived that day because Kuya Julius showed us a picture on his phone of Rafflesia flowering. And he said, yes, I saw it there just yesterday. You're in luck. And so off we went up the mountain. However, when we got there, the Rafflesia flower that he had seen was a black septic mass. So it had finished in just 24 hours. And that's the nature of Rafflesia. They open for a few days, just 2 days in some species, and then they senesce. And then all that you have are the buds. the sort of the promises of what might have been. And so this was the bud of Rafflesia bonarhauensis. And it was a sort of bittersweet encounter, because to see Rafflesia even in bud is something that you know is special, but at the same time you just want to see one in full bloom, and that's what every botanist hopes for. And so it was a little bit challenging that day to have made our way there. Not a particularly difficult trek, I have to say, on this occasion. Nevertheless, not to have found it. And I really feel those disappointments. And most Rafflesia treks end in failure, I have to say. So there are no guarantees in a Rafflesia hunt, particularly in the Philippines, where sometimes you have to trek for a long time without success. I can report that in my sped up videos, this was Mount Bonarhau about 3 weeks ago. And so we returned to the mountain in search of our Rafflesia again. And here it is. So finally, we managed to find it. This is a medium-sized Rafflesia. It's about the size of a dinner plate. And it grows only on this mountain. So this is such a rare species, and to see one is truly special. So I was very excited at the end of February to have found it. Now things are going to get a bit more tough as I take us deeper into the province and further into the rainforests. We're in search of a rarer species of Rafflesia. And so we set off 4 botanists and a group of foresters and their dogs. And we set off into the forest in search of this particular Rafflesia species called Rafflesia leonardi. And at this point, we'd been out just for a couple of weeks, but I was starting to feel a bit sort of wilder, hadn't really trimmed my beard, sort of none of my clothes felt clean. I'd eaten rice for days, really wanted some cereal, and the rain just came down in torrents. And when I say rain, it starts off with this sort of plasticky noise in the canopy where it taps the leaves, and then it's like someone's poured a bath over you and everything gets wet. And we sat down, and periodically the guys light a fire to ward off biting insects, of which there are many. And I put my hand down, and then there was this worm of astonishing proportions, about the size of a snake, that seemed sort of as offended by me as I was by it, and then it sort of sucked itself like giant spaghetti back down into the underworld. Anyway, we made our way through the forest, and this was a fairly difficult trek that people love it when I say this, so I'll say it. We actually swung on vines, and you have to do that sometimes because you need to clear a void where there isn't a path. And the lianas that we use are actually the tetrastigma vines that are the hosts of Rafflesia. So there we were, swinging our way through the forest to find this. So we got all the way to the place where the foresters said that Rafflesia had been seen before. And again, all we found was a bud, and only one of them. This is Rafflesia leonardi in bud. And I think it was smirking at us. For all the world, I saw a smirk on that flower bud. And this is my painting of it, and I wanted to capture that smirk. And so Pat, who I mentioned earlier, Adrian's boss, ordered the foresters up and down the slope to find us a flower. And so 5 foresters went off into the unknown, and 4 dogs followed them, and 4 botanists sat watching their mission disintegrate, and 1 bud smirked at them. And we were not to find Rafflesia that day. So again, another Rafflesia trek that ended in failure. However, the forest gave us a peace offering. So this is a really rare species of jade vine that you won't see in cultivation. This is Strongylodonthe elmeri. The one I'm holding on the left is a poor specimen because it was the closest I could get to it. The one on the right there was as high in the canopy as the ceiling is here. And it produces these blue flowers that grow in orbs, these sort of shining, luminous blue globes that hang like chandeliers out of the gloom in the canopy. I mean, what could be more special than that? It was the most exciting thing. And so I scrambled up into this tree to get as close as I could to one of them. And I managed to pull what they grow on these long sort of cable-like vines. And I managed to pull a small one towards me and held it like a sort of fragile bird. And like all held birds, it fled. And then out of my hands, it went. And then I fell out of the tree. And I had an equally impressive, if less beautiful, blue bruise on my thigh for quite a long time afterwards. But it was worth it. And these are my paintings of the pitcher plants that grow on that mountain, and the jade vines. And then again, we went further into the forest to places where there are no longer any roads. And so we travel by bike to get to where we need to. And that's George, one of the foresters who took me on the back of his bike. These guys lead quite difficult lives. He was telling me that he's been threatened at gunpoint many times in these forests that he works to protect by people looting, illegally cutting trees in the forest. But these guys took me up into the wilderness, where this time we found closed-mouthed secrets in the form of Rafflesia buds, even less developed than the one we'd seen a few days before, glinting like sort of conkers, I suppose, in the undergrowth. But at this point in the expedition, I was starting to think more like the forest, and I suppose I saw these more as harbingers of what's to come rather than failures. It's a sad reality, but it's one that I have to share as part of a talk like this. Deforestation, and that's something that you will see in Southeast Asia. So I suppose we take for granted that most of our own habitats in places like the UK, where we are tonight, were cut down a long time ago. The forests here were cut down more recently, but there's something rather sad, I think, about driving past gaunt, worn-out, desert-brown hills where you have little vestiges of forest, lonely trees lurking in the crevices, and you think, gosh, what have we done? But I won't dwell on that because I want to take you to a place where nature is still in charge. So this is in Kalinga in the north of Luzon in the Philippines. And this is one of these places that I told you hardly anyone gets to go. So it's not somewhere that you can go, this particular forest, as a tourist. I needed special permission, and that's one of the great things about being a botanist that I get. And we went to the Balbalasang Balabalang forest in Kalinga, which is this wonderful, wonderful wilderness of sort of pinnacles of dreamland that fold over the horizon like a Toblerone bar. And you drive in and out of mists. There are no telegraph poles. There's no internet. There's no phone signal. There's nothing. So it's like sort of going forward in space and back in time. And to go to a place like this is just such a privilege. And the forest that we went to, Pat told me that I would be the only botanist beside him and Adrian who'd ever been to this particular forest. It was unbotanized, and the first Westerner ever to go to this forest. And so that for me was truly a privilege to be taken to this special place. And I owe a huge debt of thanks to the Banao tribe, the Banao Indigenous community, who made me feel so welcome in their forest, looked after me. And these people, I'm a botanist, but these people know their forest far better than I ever will, for whatever plants I can name or not name. They know these plants well, and they know how they're useful in ways that I can never understand. And as I say, they made me feel very welcome, and so I'm very thankful to these people. And this is what we woke to in the mornings. It's interesting because when I look back at these photographs, I see such beauty, but at the time it felt a little bit tormenting, if I'm honest, because I was really quite tired at this point. So we tend to get up quite early in the morning. And when I say in the morning, I mean the previous night. So sort of 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning to travel and cover the distances that we needed to, and then sometimes trekking in the dark to get to where we had to and to cover the distance. And the terrain could be really difficult. And also, you're not necessarily feeling your best, you know. So I was not eating the things that I was used to. I wasn't sleeping, and so finding it quite difficult, I suppose, by this point. This is one of the trips we made into the forest where we saw a peculiar mistletoe, and Kuya Misang darted up into a tree and deftly cut down a piece and gave it to us so that we could press it for the herbarium. And this is the sort of terrain that we were trekking through, a wonderful place, the lost world, where sort of tree ferns rise up out of the mist, and you kind of expect to see dinosaurs still. Goodness knows there are plenty of other creatures to keep you busy, and plants that I'd never seen before, not even the like. We tended to travel upriver for the most part. In this fathomless place, the river seemed to go backwards and forwards, but the going upriver was the easiest way to cover the distance because the vegetation is so thick. There's quite often just no way through, and we'd come across boulders and cliffs that you just couldn't scale. There was no way we could get up them. Excitement struck in this pathless forest when we found a new species, which we haven't yet described, but we're about to. So I've just illustrated it and we've written the paper. This is an Aescanathus, and I can't remember what we've named it actually, which is embarrassing. I think we named it after the Banau tribe, but don't quote me on that. This is a plant that had not been documented before, and it was just leaning out of the gloom, waiting to be seen and to be described. There are so many other species that we haven't even seen yet. And actually, my colleagues in the Philippines have got a long stack of these waiting to be described because they find things more quickly than they're able to write them up. That's another story. On the right there is a plant that you may be familiar with, even if you don't know the tropical flora. This is an epipodium or epipogium, a ghost orchid. And I had to do a double take when I saw that. This is a flower that's really very rare in the UK, so rare that, in fact, that it's often declared extinct. And then in desultory ways, it reinstates itself in various beach woodlands, typically around the south of the UK, and then disappears again, goes under the radar for another decade or so. Anyhow, this is a very similar but actually different species that was growing here in the rainforest. And it's a peculiar thing. It's parasitic on a fungus rather than a plant, but I don't have time to say more about that. But it looked like little white, newly formed moths sitting at the top of their stem, waiting to take flight. And this is a fragile, beautiful thing that probably only lasts in those conditions for a few days, I would think. So like a dandelion clock, something to be admired and then gone in a trice. And we get deeper into the forest. And at one point, we reached a cliff that we couldn't easily get up. And so Kuya Willis, he had collected a sort of spool of liana, of vine, that he managed to scramble up this bank, up a cliff, and then tether it to a tree. And then we had to sort of climb up this wire-like tendril to get to the top of the cliff. And this is where things start to get quite difficult, for me at least.
I'm wet, covered in vegetation, covered in leeches. I'm bleeding, I'm tired, but there is no choice but to press on because I'm right in the middle of the Philippines' greatest wilderness. There's no other way out, so on we go.
And then I think shortly after I recorded that in my slightly delirious state, things got really hard, and the tribe used their machetes to bore a tunnel through this vegetation, in which it was hard to see where the floor and where the ceiling was in this tunnel of ferns. And then we were sort of spat out the other side in this river, and we crawled up this slope, and then we found Rafflesia flowers all around us. And it's still an experience that honestly I'll never forget. A memory for me that's sort of diamond sharp, crawling up that forest, covered in leeches, covered in blood, bits of fern in my hair and everything. And then to find these flowers that just burst through from the earth, it's just an otherworldly experience. They were huge, half a metre across, and the flowers had sort of bored up through the earth, and they sort of sit in this pile of earth, and as if they'd been struck by lightning, dragged out of the earth, sort of all blackened around them, and almost a different light that shone on them. There's something so other about these flowers. It's hard to describe, but this is what I recorded on seeing it.
We're here at last. I've taken a moment away from the group who are sitting quietly with the flowers, admiring them. There's a sort of weary content among the group. We've come such a long way for this, and it means so much. It's quite emotional, actually. I guess because of the trek and because it's such an extraordinary flower.
So yeah, so as I say, I'm very grateful to the Banao tribe for sharing their special flower with me, and it's something that I will never forget. And I did an illustration when I got back, and my colleagues had a print done of it and gave it to the tribe, which made me very proud to know that they have my picture there in Kalinga. But I need to take us on the second leg of our adventure because I'm running out of time. Spent a long time in the Philippines. So Rafflesia is a flower in peril. 67% of Rafflesia populations grow in unprotected habitats. I briefly touched upon deforestation. Land conversion is the biggest risk. But what to do about that? Because Rafflesia, as I've mentioned, is virtually ungrowable. Few people have had any success in trying to grow it. But there is one place where they have, as I'll show you in a moment. On the next leg of our adventure, we're joined by Jocko Ritono, who's a fantastic botanist who specializes in palms. I mean, he's based in Bogor in Indonesia, in Java. I've come to know these people very well now. We're a bit like a little family that work on Rafflesia. And this is my picture of Jocko with Rafflesia patma, a species that we saw down in Pangandaran in Java. One that it's a long drive, but very easy trek to get to. Oh, and there's me with it, so you can see the scale. It's sort of a half-size Rafflesia, about a dinner plate across. But now I must introduce to you who I think of as a wizard because he achieves things that are nothing short of magic. This is Mr. Nagatari, who is a propagator at Bogor Botanic Garden in Indonesia. And my colleagues from the Philippines, who you've met, joined me on an expedition to Indonesia, where we had a private workshop from Mr. Nagatari on how to propagate Rafflesia. I've never paid so much attention in my life as I did to this lesson, where I was following everything he did on the tricks of how to grow Rafflesia. It involves grafting because Rafflesia, as I mentioned, is a parasite inside a vine. So the only way you can grow it is to take an infected vine and introduce it to an uninfected one, where Rafflesia, if you're lucky, leaps from one to the other, and then you've duplicated it. So that was our workshop, and I'll explain in a moment why we learned to do it. Along the way, we did have an earthquake, which was unusual for me. I've never had one, but never been in one before. And we were sitting in a meeting, and then everything started to shake quite violently. We were actually only about 30 miles, as my phone shows you with that blue dot from the epicenter. And this made getting about a little bit difficult. But I'm going to hop over now, still in Indonesia, to Sumatra. And it makes me very happy seeing this picture. Again, I've been made to feel so welcome by all the people I work with in Southeast Asia. So the chap on the right in the blue t-shirt, that's Deki. And he'd been messaging me for many years, telling me about the plight of Rafflesia, where he lives in Bengkulu in Sumatra, and how worried he was about what's happening with Rafflesia. And I wanted to visit him and to find out myself what was happening. And so my colleagues from the Philippines and Jocko, we visited, and then I stayed with Deki in his family home. And I have to say, the food in Sumatra is just to die for. Deki actually grew up at the foot of this mountain. This is Bukit Daun in Sumatra, and this is Deki's stomping grounds. This is a place where giant animals and plants lurk in the forest depths. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. And here is Deki taking us into what effectively is his back garden.
Okay. One step. Okay. 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 Okay.
And this is what you see. Isn't it extraordinary? This is Rafflesia Kamumu, one of the larger ones, as you can see. A very rare species. It grows in Kamumu, which is Deki's home village area. And as I described in the book, 7 guys sit on the slope of the forest that sort of decanter the forest that aligned them, and sit staring at this one flower that sort of stares out into the forest. It's a really strange experience to sit there with this work of nature in a way that it's difficult for me to do justice with words. but to see something this special, wow. And that was my painting, my pencil drawing of it. I mean, at this point, Deki asked me to kiss the flower, which I did, which is a bit strange. And after that, we headed into the interior of Bengkulu, not too far from the place where Sir Stamford Raffles described Rafflesia. And I'm so touched that the guys at the Linnean Society, I know those of you online can't see, but we've got some illustrations, engravings, and letters from encounter. So Joseph Arnold, who joined Stamford Raffles, who was a colonial official out there, described his experience of finding Rafflesia. In a way, I mentioned earlier that we don't talk about discovery anymore because these plants were known, of course, by the people who lived there long before Stamford Raffles or Joseph Arnold actually brought them to the attention of the West. So discovery is not quite the right way to think about it. But nevertheless, their encounters were described in a way that I think brings to life some of the magic of their adventures. Here are some gifts from the forest. You have to be comfortable with insects and biting things because pill millipedes, they're rather like the pill bugs we have here in our gardens, but they're like cannonballs that roll around the forest. Ants, that's on Decky's arm, but ants the size of, I don't know what, huge, longer than my thumb. And this one actually managed to make its way into the vehicle. And then strange millipedes that Decky's quite blasé about these, so he asks me to pick everything up, and trusting him, I do, and then tells me afterwards that they bite, or in this case, left a horrible smell on my hands that no amount of sanitizer could 24 hours. Decky's also a fan of snakes. So unbeknownst to me, he was temporarily keeping some snakes for observation in our vehicle. And so he decided to share these with me one day. And so he took out this this brown snake. He's like, this one, Mr. Chris, is cat snake. And then this one, he flourished like a wand on this stick, is pit viper, and he's very, very deadly. And then he put it back in its not very well contained blue lidded plastic box and stowed it safely back under my seat. And here is Decky with a Rafflesia flower bud. This is the Rafflesia arnoldi. This is the largest flower in the world. So this grows only in only in Sumatra and also Borneo, but Sumatra is the main place to see it, and it spans a metre across. And here are the two guys that took us to see this flower, an extraordinary thing, sort of erupting out of the forest floor. Those are some pictures of me with it. The one on the left there, incidentally, a bit of the petal lobe met with an accident, probably a falling branch, and the guys had lovingly stitched it back together with a piece of reed, as you can see. So they care very deeply for their flowers in Bengkulu. There are other giants that lurk in these forests. So this is the Titanarum, not to be confused with Rafflesia. People often confuse the two. This one you can see in botanic gardens. It's very easy to grow. On the left, there is the leaf, which has monstrous proportions, the size of a tree. And then on the right, there is the flowering structure. It's not the largest flower in the world. It's a flowering structure that contains many little flowers. This was what Decky told me was going to be some luxury accommodation that we were staying in the south of a place called Kawur, where we went to see this extraordinary species. And I think this is the last species I'm showing with you in the talk. And in some ways, I think of it as the most special. It's a very rare one, that's for sure. Not many people have seen it. It's called Rafflesia benkuluensis, and it only grows in this area. And it had this sort of strange, ghostly white appearance, this huge, bloodless flower that looked as if it had been glanced at by the moon, pulled right out of the earth like an exorcism, just sort of sitting there on the blackened leaves. A very, very strange experience. And we went into the forest to see it, and then everyone sort of whispered as we got close to it, and then Decky ushered us towards it as if we were sort of family visiting a newborn child or something. And these are the local people who show me the flower. So that's Yogi on the left, and on the right there is Dang Zul, who's the village leader in this particular village in Kaworn. This is not far from where I took that photograph and did those paintings. So this is an example of land conversion. It's a very real problem, and this is a forest that had been cut down quite recently. It's what's called slash and burn. But this is smallholder farmers trying to make a living. So this is not necessarily a big commercial operation. These are people who live next to the forest, and they need that land to grow their crops. So this is not an easy thing to square. I'm coming towards the end of the adventure, but before I do, we head north and take a boat to a part of the forest where Sumatran elephants still roam, a very wild place where the people are very happy and very welcoming, and they do a great green roof, by the way. But we were here to see a particular species or population of Rafflesia. Oh, I have to include the elephant. Those who know me well know that I'm not really interested in mammals and I prefer the plants. But for the zoologists among us, I have to include that. This slide is blank for a good reason. I deliberately made it so because the Rafflesia population that we were there to see had been destroyed deliberately. So we travelled for a long way to get to it, and then someone had destroyed both Rafflesia and the vine that it was growing on. It was difficult for me to understand from the broken communication what had happened, but piecing it together, I think it's because Rafflesia can generate unwanted attention. And it's very easy for me to say that everyone should marvel over Rafflesia. But actually, if you have a living to make and you need that land to grow crops, the sad reality is that you're going to make more of a return on converting that land for oil palm plantations than you are by charging a small fee for someone to come and look at Rafflesia. And that's a difficulty to overcome. Don't worry, I don't have too much longer to talk, but I do need to go back to the Philippines briefly for the last couple of slides, where I'm joined by our group of foresters, and we go back up Mount Makiling, back to the land of jade vines. And there we collected an infected portion of Rafflesia vine with permission, just a small amount from this population where Rafflesia grows prolifically. This is my illustration of Pat with his team of foresters choosing the infected vine. And then we took it to the land grant, which was a place that I mentioned earlier, where actually when we arrived, there had been an armed conflict just that morning. But the policemen there wanted group photos and selfies, which was interesting. But we made our way to a particular part of the forest where there is a tetrastigma vine. That's the host of Rafflesia that Pat and his colleagues had identified for us, that we thought was a suitable candidate for us to try growing Rafflesia in the land grant. And so the skills that we learned from Mr. Nagatari in Indonesia, we put to good use. And so we tried our propagation experiment where we introduced a piece of infected Rafflesia vine to a vine in the land grant. And when I say in the book that I slept with the vines by my pillow, I'm not exaggerating, I did that. It's the most precious thing I've ever had in my possession. And so we did that graft in the forest and then left that forest in a slightly different way to how we found it. And this was us just visiting a couple of weeks ago to check on our graft. And I can report that whilst we don't know if Rafflesia has taken successfully, because that will take a couple more years, we do know that the vine has taken and has welded to the other vine that we've put it on. So there's every chance to believe that it will be successful. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that delightful, emotive, beautiful, and insightful talk. I think it was, I think it's a really important thing to remember. With the scientists, the emotional context for what we do is incredibly important, and a privilege. Thank you very much for sharing these wonderful plants with us. We've got time for 1 or 2 questions, and then you're welcome to come upstairs where we'll have a little wine reception, and also we'll have some books for sale if you'd like to buy the book upstairs. So, gentlemen here. This gentleman here's got a question.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. This is just while a wonderful explorer's talk, if you like, with a bit of science. But what I wondered, you're working with so many species of Rafflesia, whether you've noticed any evolutionary processes going on. And one thing I wanted to ask on the back of that, is there any suggestion of partial carnivory, these flies that go into the flower? Is it possible that some of them might die and, enrich the flower?
Yeah, so thanks. So Ray, the question was about evolutionary processes and whether or not in any way carnivorous. I'll answer those in reverse. So no evidence of carnivory at all. So completely parasitic, so a big thief in the plant kingdom, if you will. But it needs its flies to get from one flower to another. So it's not in the plant's interests, if you like, for it to lose them along the way. In terms of evolutionary processes, yes, I'm very interested in speciation, and that's sort of my background, and how these how the 40 or so, whether there are more, we don't know, species came to be, and so what are the driving forces behind that? So, but that's something that's very much still embryonic in terms of the research. But thanks, Ray.
Time all. No, I think there's a bit of a race. I think we're out front.
I just want to say thank you for such a lovely talk. How has your interaction with the locals, the Indigenous community and the tribes affected your view on research?
Yeah, thank you for your question. For those online was how has working with Indigenous peoples affected my view of botanical research? Is that right? So, I mean, really just that I have a profound and deep respect for these people, and I feel very lucky to have worked with them. I think also that they have a connectedness and an understanding of the landscape that I feel I'm just a sort of visitor in their world. And so my training, if you like, is very much through sort of classical botany and naming things or making sense of things scientifically. But they make sense of the world in a different way, but in a way that is just as valid and actually more so when I'm out there, because there was an example when I was in a really remote forest of when I got stung quite badly by a dendrocnide tree, and my arm was just weeping and it looked an absolute mess. And I wouldn't know what to do with it. And I had some antihistamine in my bag or whatever. But the guys knew that actually, if you just take a piece of a stem of the same tree and then sort of skin it, you can use it as a balm, as a stick on your arm, and it takes away some of the pain. And so I owe a lot to those guys. So really, in answer to your question, I have a profound respect for them.
We've got two more questions. The chap just behind.
Thank you for a great talk. I have a question. So, say that I think the pieces, right? So like that as well. Some of the rare ones. I was wondering, in your travels, did you ever post evidence of the rare plants being used, things like medicine?
Yeah, thank you. So the question was about poaching and exploitation of plants. Rafflesia is not really poached, actually, for the reason that it can't be grown. So it is at least saved that in a way that orchids and pitcher plants might not be. It really is far more a threat of land conversion, and in effect that can be harder to solve, because it's very easy for me to go over to places and say, oh, we must protect Rafflesia, but I'm not the one that has to make a living from the land. And so there are things that we can do, and trying to grow it ex situ is one of them, and that's something I'm really interested in trying to do. And it means that much as I might wish that we could prevent deforestation everywhere all the time, I know we can't. And so if there are other tools within our toolkit that we can use to conserve it, then propagation might be one. But in more direct answer to your question, yes, in the Philippines, they told me that there had been a spate of people taking particularly epiphytic ferns, actually, as well as orchids. And then during COVID, I think, where people didn't have money, and so they went into the forest to collect things and then sold them on the internet. And then people around the world purchase them and don't necessarily think about where they come from at source. So yes, poaching is a problem, but thankfully for Rafflesia, it's not a big one, but there are other perils.
Take one more question. I think there's somebody.
You say that they're pollinated by flies. Is it particular species of flies or any old flies? Your photographs don't show the flies.
Yeah, thank you. The question was which flies are pollinating Rafflesia. Don't know is the reality. Very interested in the question. I took a really nice video, I didn't put it in actually recently, of Rafflesia arnoldii teeming with flies. And I'm not an entomologist, but I could see that there were all sorts of different flies moving around in there. I guess the question though is which of those are then actually collecting the pollen and delivering it somewhere else? And really that isn't known. And of the 40 or so species, we don't have those data and we don't have that evidence to know what is pollinating them. But I'm interested as well in the fact that they smell different too. And that's something we're actually working on at the moment, analysing why do they smell different and could they be attracting different flies? So love the question, but we don't know the answer, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much for that delightful talk. Just there's one last thank you very much.